Picture this. You're lying in bed. It's dark. It's quiet. Or maybe it's just too loud. Inside your head. You hit play, hoping for ocean waves or gentle piano. But surprise. Tonight, you're getting rats, pus, and existential dread. Cozy, right? Forget ghost stories. This one has no jump scares. Just real historical horror featuring coughing neighbors, questionable medical advice, and a whole lot of dead people. Welcome to the 14th century, the golden age of maybe it's just allergies. Now dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket. Or garlic. People back then swore by it. Didn't work, but hey, it made them smell interesting on the way out. We're going back to a time when the church bells rang, not for weddings, but for body counts. When doctors wore bird masks because, yes, that was science. When quarantine meant lock the door and pray. Europe, 1347. A rat sneezes in a port city, and suddenly, half the continent's like, why is everyone dying? There were no TikToks, no news alerts. Just rumors, rats, and a growing list of funerals with a 2-hour wait time. So breathe in, not too deeply, and settle in. Because tonight, we're not drifting off to nature sounds. We're tumbling into the plague, and it's going to be beautifully awful. And hey, if you're enjoying this oddly relaxing descent into medieval chaos, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if it feels right, of course. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's tuning in while the world quietly unravels. One bedtime story at a time. Well, let's start. The air smelled like bread, sweat, and livestock, basically, ode to Middle Ages. Towns were getting louder, markets were buzzing, and people were weirdly optimistic. Sure, knights were still decapitating each other in the name of honor. And yes, a paper cut from a cursed scroll could kill you. But overall, spirits were up. There was music in the taverns, gossip in the streets, and just the right amount of superstition to spice up daily life without making it feel like the apocalypse. Yet, you have to understand, Europe thought it had made it. After centuries of war, crusades, and feudal drama, things were finally looking up. There was land to till, coins to earn, an ale that didn't taste like regret. Cities began to expand like teens discovering personal space, and for the first time in forever, people actually thought, hey, maybe we're not doomed. Then the rats showed up. But let's not rush the punchline. For now, let's stay in the moment. When life still smelled awful but felt decent. Streets were filthy, sure, but full of life. Bakers yelled over blacksmiths, kids zigzagged through donkey traffic, and monks briskly ignored pickpockets tugging at their robes. It was chaotic in that warm, slightly moldy way. Like a crowded house with leaky ceilings, annoying, but still home. Most families lived in spaces smaller than your closet. Privacy was a myth. Hygiene was a gamble. If you had a blanket and someone warm to spoon without judgment, you were basically royalty. And yes, disease existed. Leprosy, dysentery, rashes that made your neighbor resemble overcooked beets. But at least those horrors had names. People feared them, but in a familiar, oh, that again kind of way. Still, far beyond the reach of anyone who could spell epidemiology, something ancient was stirring. Silent, invisible, not a war, not a famine, just movement. Along trade routes and through distant ports, something too small to see was making its way west. And spoiler, it didn't need a visa. But over here, life went on. People danced around maypoles, roasted pigs, and tossed coins at jugglers as if the universe wasn't about to flip the table. Priests preached about sin, redemption, and moral decay, completely overlooking the real threat: plague rats with attitude. No one, not a single soul, was prepared to have their worldview shattered by fleas. Because why would they? Tomorrow was just another Tuesday. Then again, history never knocks. It just kicks the door in. You might picture the arrival of doom as something dramatic. People fainting in the streets, prophets screaming nonsense. But no. It started like a bad cold. A sailor coughing. A merchant looking a bit off. A kid whose fever stuck around longer than it should. Isolated cases. Nothing to write a folk song about. Doctors, and we're using that term loosely, recommended prayers, leeches, and the occasional bloodletting, just to keep things exciting. No one connected the dots. Because when your past includes the Inquisition, a mild plague feels like Tuesday with extra sneezing. But the map was already bleeding. Towns vanished like flickering candles. Ships docked with no one left to tie the ropes. Markets stood empty. Goats wandered into churches, confused and unbothered. Still, no one used the word plague. Denial is a hell of a public health policy. Why didn't they name it? Because they couldn't. There were no words. No sermons, no fairy tales. No curse dramatic enough to explain what was happening. This wasn't illness. This was reality quietly unraveling. A slow-motion collapse with no soundtrack. And while Europe basked in its premature golden age, the shadow crept in. Ironically, this was supposed to be a time of progress. Universities were popping up. Trade was booming. Art and philosophy were stretching their legs. Humanity was having a moment. Meanwhile, the rats didn't care. Fleas didn't pause for poetry. They boarded ships, skipped borders, and strolled across the continent like they owned the place. If you paid close attention, even the air started acting weird. Crisp one day, heavy the next. But people kept moving. Because they always do. Right up until they don't. In that narrow space between normal and catastrophe, there was still time to believe everything was fine. That tomorrow would look kind of like today. That the worst was probably behind them. It wasn't. Something had already arrived. And it had no plans to leave quietly. It started, like most world-ending things, not with fanfare, but with a port. The city of Kaffa, tucked on the edge of the Black Sea, had seen its share of drama. Merchants, mercenaries, Mongols, all very on-brand. But in 1347, something else showed up. Something that didn't knock, didn't wait, and definitely didn't ask permission. A siege had just ended. The Mongols had tried to breach the walls of Kaffa, failed, and decided to get creative. According to some not at all dramatic accounts, they flung plague-ridden corpses over the walls like a parting gift. You know, medieval goodbye etiquette. Whether that story is true or just historical gossip, one thing's certain. What came next was worse. Ships, cargo galleys packed with fabrics, spices, and something a little less marketable, plague. Sailors coughing blood, eyes sunken, skin blooming in shades of something's definitely wrong. Some died mid-journey. Some died docking. But the ships kept going, ghosting their way west like floating Amazon deliveries of doom. Messina was first. A cozy Sicilian port just minding its own business. Officials expected merchants. What they got was pestilence in disguise. Days later, the docks were silent. Weeks later, so were the streets. The city slammed its gates shut, but rats don't really care about lockdowns. The plague moved like a juicy rumor, whispered, denied, and always faster than the facts. From Messina to Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, Valencia. It didn't crawl. It leapt. Sometimes it beat the wind to the next harbor. And wherever it landed, it left a thick silence behind. People didn't know what they were dealing with. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill rash or that one thing that made people sweat until they exploded. This was different. Fever. Then lumps, buboes, as they'd later be charmingly called. Angry black knots in places no one wants angry black knots. Then vomiting. Then blood. Then quiet. Doctors blamed the stars. Priests blamed sin. Regular people blamed the Jews. Entire communities were burned for causing the plague, as if torching your neighbor would somehow improve public health. Cures ranged from questionable to insane. Crushed emeralds. Roasted onions soaked in vinegar. Sitting between two bonfires to sweat out the bad air. And, of course, the classic, bloodletting. Because nothing says recovery like draining your life force with a rusty knife. In cities, the smell of death eventually beat out the smell of incense. Bells rang non-stop. Cemeteries ran out of room. Coffins became luxury items. People were buried like lasagna, layer after layer, dirt, corpse, repeat until despair sets in. In the countryside, it arrived slower, but lingered like an unwanted dinner guest. Villages simply disappeared. Empty fields, abandoned homes, dogs waiting by doors that would never open again. In some places, there were more corpses than counters to count them. And still, ships came. From city to city. From island to shore. Some ports tried early quarantine. 40 days offshore, no contact. But humans are bad at waiting, and diseases are worse at asking permission. What made it all worse? Denial. Glorious, deadly denial. Even as people collapsed, some claimed it was just exaggerated. Fake news, if you will, that their streets were too clean, their prayers too pure, their soup too hot for illness to spread. They were wrong. But for a short while, life limped on. Bakers still baked. Lovers still whispered in alleys. Children played, though fewer made it back for dinner. Hope is stubborn like that. It clings, even when the roof's on fire. Still, let's be clear. Europe had officially entered Act 1 of its biggest disaster yet. No trumpets. Just coughs. No hero's entrance. Just rats, scurrying down ropes like they had somewhere very specific to be. You might wonder, why not just burn the ships? Great idea. Some did. But mostly, greed spoke louder. Silk, spice, wheat, hard to throw away when there's money to be made. Merchants blinked, did the math, and left the plague to do its thing. So the ports stayed open, and the Black Death didn't sneak in. It strolled, uninvited, unapologetic, and punctual. From that silence, the scream had already begun. And no, there wasn't panic. Not yet. No priests sobbing at altars. No nobles galloping through streets with grave warnings. Europe did what it does best. Stared at the wall and hoped it was someone else's problem. The first corpses, quietly wrapped, muttered over, buried deep. Bad luck, maybe. Some weird curse. Or perhaps just a celestial bad mood. But it didn't stop. The coughs got louder. The fevers came faster. The swellings popped, not just with pus, but with pure, unfiltered panic. Still, no one dared call it plague. Because naming it made it real. And real monsters are harder to ignore. Towns tried everything. Some shut their gates. Some marched in circles whipping their backs until someone noticed. Others just tossed more coins at the church, hoping maybe death took bribes. But the path was already drawn. And death? Death wasn't walking. It was sprinting. Ships began arriving in Venice and Genoa like haunted house guests. No crew on deck, no welcome aboard, just full cargo holds and an overwhelming scent of doom. The sailors who did stumble off looked less like merchants and more like animated corpses on their last commercial voyage. And the dead? They didn't disembark. They waited, in silence, in shadows, in numbers. Markets emptied. The bells rang for funerals until they didn't ring at all. Not because the dead stopped coming, but because the bell ringers were dead too. People stopped using words. Instead, they left coins in bowls outside doors, hoping whatever they were buying didn't come with a side of contagion. Bread was dropped on windowsills like edible prayers. Dogs roamed the streets like they had inherited civilization. Honestly, some of them ran it better. Doctors, and we use that word generously, paraded around in terrifying leather bird masks stuffed with herbs, flowers, and unowned confidence. They looked like plague-themed mascots for a nightmare carnival. Their best advice? Avoid miasmas and maybe try not dying. And still, no one quite knew how it worked. Was it the air? The stars? An angry saint with a vendetta? Theories were traded faster than food, each one more useless than the last. Avoid bad smells, they said, while standing next to open graves. Entire families disappeared in a week. Children died before their parents. Parents died before they could grieve. Homes were left open, as if death had forgotten to shut the door behind him. And it kept going. When the churches overflowed, when even the gravediggers threw in the towel, and sometimes their shovels, that's when it hit. This wasn't something you could outpray, outrun, or outsmart. This wasn't a bad harvest. This was the universe flipping the table mid-dinner. You could see it in their eyes. Wide, hollow, always searching for someone not coughing. Neighbors crossed the street like each other's breath was loaded. People stopped saying hello, because hello implied there'd be a goodbye. Some tried to escape. Into the mountains. Into the woods. Into places no one really wanted them. They brought the plague with them, of course. An unwelcome guest wrapped in silence and denial. A contagious souvenir from the city. And that silence? It was heavy. Not just the absence of people, but the absence of life. No gossip. No arguments over bread prices. No flirtations. Just wind, bells, and the slow creak of doors swinging open and never closing again. And somehow, unbelievably, the sun kept rising. As if nothing was happening. As if the sky hadn't noticed the world below was unraveling like a badly sewn tunic. But something had changed. Deeply. The fear shifted. It grew legs, found a place to sit beside you, and waited. It didn't yell. It didn't wave its arms. It just stayed, quiet and constant. Dread with a face and a schedule. So the question wasn't if it would reach your town. It was, what will you do when it does? By now, death had a calendar. It showed up like clockwork. Cough on Monday. Collapse by Tuesday. By Thursday, the house was bolted from the outside. No one inside was coming out, and if they did, they didn't look quite right. If no one cleared the bodies by Saturday, the smell would do the announcing. But what made this more terrifying than any war or storm or medieval disaster before it was the slow disintegration of the things people trusted most. The church? Silent. Overwhelmed. Priests tried to offer comfort until they themselves became cautionary tales. Confession became a gamble. Holy water lost its magic. Suddenly, faith, the last shield for many, began to wobble like a rickety stool missing a leg. So where do you go when the church fails? Doctors? The ones dressed like cursed pigeons, still draining blood as if life was a clogged sink? They kept slicing and prescribing garlic like it was a miracle. It wasn't. The nobles? Hiding in their manors behind iron gates and thick walls, throwing servants into the fire like disposable chess pieces. Their castles stood tall, cold, and profoundly useless, decorative tombs in waiting. Family? Friends? That's where it really hurt. The plague made you see danger in the people you loved. Mothers stepped away from their children. Friends stopped embracing. Lovers slept on opposite ends of the bed, or not at all. Compassion became risky. Affection became loaded. Touch became treason. And when fear devours your ability to care, what's left? Some gave in. Fully. They stole. Drank. Partied like the world was ending, because it was. People danced through the streets, half naked and laughing like the punchline of some divine joke. If the world was a sinking ship, they'd go down tipsy and twirling. Others fled into isolation. Hills, forests, caves, vanishing into silence like monks with a hangover. No speaking, no touching, just existing, until they didn't. And then came the flagellants. Hordes of barefoot pilgrims parading from town to town, beating themselves with ropes and sticks, hoping divine attention worked like a loyalty program. They believed pain could earn forgiveness, that the blood they spilled would somehow counterbalance the blood being spilled all around them. Spoiler, it didn't. Crowds gathered to watch. Because of course they did. What else was there to do? Some joined in, others just stared, slack-jawed, wide-eyed, caught somewhere between prayer and panic. It was like watching history punch itself in the face, and nobody wanted to miss it. And the plague? It didn't care. It didn't pause to consider your virtue or your sin count. It didn't check your last confession or your hygiene routine. It just moved, quiet as fog, ruthless as rent. Town by town, it rolled in like a drumbeat no one could muffle. Civilization didn't collapse in a bang. It unraveled. Slowly, annoyingly, like a sweater caught on a nail. Markets shuttered. Courts went silent. Money? Worthless. Try buying bread with gold when the baker's dead, the oven's cold, and the rats are running inventory. Time itself gave up. Days blurred into weeks. Seasons passed without introductions. Calendars became glorified bookmarks for a story no one wanted to finish. And yet, somehow, through all of this, humanity leaked through the cracks. A widow lighting a candle for someone whose name she'd already started to forget. A child leaving bread on a doorstep, not knowing if the person inside could still reach the door. A priest blessing the air, just in case God still checked in from time to time. In those fleeting, flickering acts of grace, you could almost believe something good had survived. Because even as the world smoldered in quiet misery, someone, somewhere, was still choosing kindness. Against logic, against odds, against plague. And maybe that's why we remember this. Not because it was gruesome, but because it was human. Strange, isn't it? That a world can end so softly. No fire raining from the skies. No epic battles. Sometimes it just stops. A cart that doesn't come. A bell that doesn't ring. A voice that used to call your name, now silent. By the time the plague reached its crescendo, death was no longer news. It was wallpaper, the scent in the air, the pause in conversation. Entire cities stopped counting, not for lack of care, but for lack of math. Whole neighborhoods were sealed like medieval Tupperware, houses full of bodies, boarded shut by those who had the luxury of doing so and the stomach to walk away. Others wandered the streets aimlessly, not because they had somewhere to go, but because sitting still felt like a challenge to fate. Death had become ordinary, like rain, like gossip, like regret. And yet, not everyone collapsed into despair. Some found freedom in the chaos. With no rules, why not rewrite the script? A beggar became the town's baker. A washerwoman became midwife, mayor, and mortician, all before lunch. With no nobles left, some communities started voting, not for kings, but for who'd collect the water, mend shoes, or bury Uncle Greg. Survival became improved theater. Medieval edition. Rumors began to drift in like smoke. Places untouched by the plague. Villages protected by prayer, sea breeze, or sheer dumb luck. People packed what was left of their lives and chased these whispers, dragging hope behind them like a squeaky wheel, and, unfortunately, dragging the plague too. Still, hope persisted. It bloomed in strange places, a flower tucked into a crack in a wall, a child sketching skeletons with coal and giving them names, a woman humming while washing the dead, because silence was worse. Even art didn't die. It mutated. Painters got weirder. Writers got darker. Musicians leaned into minor chords. Hope wore eyeliner now, and death got its own theme song. People needed to feel something, anything, because numbness was just another kind of dying. And death, oddly enough, brought clarity. Suddenly, no one cared who inherited what. Arguments over land fizzled. Who owns the barn? Who cares? It's full of corpses. Priorities shifted hard and fast. Breathing trumped property rights. Walls became memorials. Names scratched into stone. Symbols left on doors. Circles. Crosses. Sometimes just handprints in ash, as if saying I was here was enough to keep being. Grief stopped needing words. It just sat beside you, like dread had done. Quiet. Familiar. Expected. And still, people endured. Not all. Not even most. But enough. Enough to dig one more grave. Bake one more loaf. Hold one more hand. Even when it felt like holding a match in a room full of oil. Enough to believe, against all logic, that someday the sun would rise, and death might not follow so closely behind. And that, oddly, was the cruelest part, that life kept going. Even when the story felt finished. Even when the curtain should have closed. But maybe, that's why it's worth telling. Eventually, the dying slowed. Not because the plague was done, but because it had fewer people left to kill. Grim math, but effective. Some towns were unrecognizable, no longer bustling, but whispering echoes of what they'd been. Streets overtaken by grass. Doors hanging like crooked mouths. Entire villages suspended in time, as if history had hit pause and wandered off. And in that silence, the survivors emerged. Not as heroes. Not unbroken. Just breathing. Squinting at the light. Suspicious of the sky. Suspicious of anything that looked like hope. Because what do you do after the world ends? You don't rebuild. Not right away. First, you search. For bread. For names. For proof that someone still remembers your face. For signs that the world remembers how to be kind. And eventually, you ask the question that always comes next. Now what? Who gets the land now? Who buries the priests? Who writes the laws when the lawmakers are all horizontal? Power didn't so much return, it relocated. It climbed out of the debris, dusted itself off, and looked around for the nearest person still upright. Merchants stepped in. Midwives turned legendary. And entire systems rebooted themselves, not because anyone held a grand vision, but because someone had to fetch water and tell the goats to stop eating the altar. Necessity, after all, doesn't ask nicely. It barks orders with garlic breath and dirt under its nails. Cities that once treated the poor like background scenery suddenly realized they were out of extras. Wages went up, not out of kindness, but because when half your labor force is in a mass grave, supply and demand gets awkward. If you could lift a sack or stir a pot, congratulations, you were now essential. Imagine that. Survive the apocalypse, and they finally admit you're useful. But not everything evolved. Some instincts stayed medieval, in all the worst ways. Fear needs a scapegoat, and humanity is excellent at choosing the wrong suspects. So the whispers started. It was the Jews, the witches, the heretics, the weird lady with too many cats. Panic sharpened into violence. Pogroms erupted. Innocents were drowned, burned, beaten, not because they were guilty, but because they were visible. Because when humans are terrified, mirrors are the last place they look. Meanwhile, in slightly more constructive corners of Europe, art took a sharp left turn. Death became trendy, skeletons waltzing in frescoes, dancing with kings and peasants alike. A real we're all screwed together aesthetic. The dance macabre wasn't just symbolism, it was documentation. But even amid the morbidity, there was light. People started writing again, not poetry, but memory. Names scrawled in margins. Symptoms listed like shopping items. Crude maps of towns you should absolutely avoid. They weren't trying to impress the future. They were just trying not to vanish. Because forgetting, they realized, was the one contagion they couldn't survive again. Rituals returned. Slowly, like someone learning to walk after a fall. Weddings happened. Small, awkward, tearful. Songs drifted back into streets, cautious and a little off-key. Bread, once a signal of loss, became a symbol of resilience again. And when a baby cried, no one hushed it. They listened. Because that cry, shrill, messy, inconvenient, meant that life had the audacity to continue. And if there's still breath, maybe, just maybe, there's still a story left to tell. Rebuilding wasn't about stacking bricks. It was about relearning how to trust a handshake. How to sit in silence without assuming death was lurking behind it. How to smile with your eyes, because the mouth had forgotten how. Even when the sickness faded, the fear lingered, tucked behind curtains, woven into small talk, stitched into every flinch at a cough. Grief hovered like fog. And then came its little cousin, guilt. Why me? Why not them? What did I do right, or horribly wrong? Priests offered explanations. Some said grace. Some said punishment delayed. A few quietly left the cloth altogether, because once you've seen a child die mid-prayer, it gets harder to sell comfort in Latin. Faith didn't die. It changed clothes. It ditched the gold, stepped off the pedestal, and started asking tougher questions. And the people followed. Why did the church fail us? Why did the doctors bleed us dry? Why did the nobles run and leave the gravediggers behind? These weren't tantrums. They were seeds. Tiny rebellions germinating in plague-soaked soil. Universities, those still standing, began to whisper dangerous things. What if we understood the body? What if sickness had causes? What if a flea could do what 1,000 swords couldn't? Ignorance had lost its charm. Turns out, it wasn't cheap. It was just wearing a disguise. Even art couldn't look away anymore. No more floating saints. No more airbrushed martyrdom. Painters picked up their brushes and painted people. Real ones. Wrinkled, sagging, sweaty. Death wasn't a punishment. It was a roommate. Music? It got heavier. The chords dropped. Melodies turned into wounds with rhythm. And language bloomed like a weed in ruins. New dialects rose. People scribbled stories like they were bailing water from a sinking ship. Writing wasn't reserved for monks anymore. It was survival. Memory on paper. Insurance against oblivion. They'd learned, the hard way, what forgetting costs. But memory needs fuel. So people fed it stories. Of the midwife who stayed. The baker who gave his bread away. The gravedigger who sang lullabies to every corpse, even when no one was listening. These weren't saints. They were just people. Muddy, exhausted, kind. And it was in their stories, soft, imperfect, human, that healing took root. Because when the world ends and somehow you're still here, you don't rebuild by blueprint. You rebuild by remembering. You rebuild by refusing to forget. By now, Europe wasn't the same. Not just its cities, but its soul. The Black Death didn't just trim the population. It thinned the distance between belief and experience, between power and people. And in that clearing, messy, sacred, uncomfortable, something new began to grow. For centuries, life was a pyramid. Kings up top, peasants underneath, and God somewhere above waving vaguely. The plague flattened that. Lords died. Servants died. The hierarchy cracked like old plaster. And suddenly, people looked around and realized the sky didn't fall when the nobleman did. And maybe, just maybe, the world didn't have to go back to the way it was. In the absence of old authorities, new voices rose, hoarse, raw, and utterly done with waiting their turn. Peasants who once whispered in corners started shouting from rooftops. Townspeople organized. Laborers stopped accepting God will reward you later and countered with, cool, but I'd like bread now. Because let's be honest, they'd buried the world. They'd earned the right to rebuild it. And in some places, they actually did. Laws bent. Guilds multiplied. Serfs left their masters' fields and just didn't come back. Some were punished. Others were heard. But one thing was clear. Silence had lost its halo. The people had survived. And they weren't whispering anymore. Meanwhile, science began to stir. Not leap, just stir. Like a scholar waking up after a decade-long nap with garlic on his breath. Herbalists started taking notes. Midwives recorded every birth, death, and suspicious sneeze. Superstition didn't vanish, but it started having to share a seat with observation. And the map of the world stretched. Trade resumed, then exploded, carrying silk, spices, philosophy, and, of course, more diseases. Because once the door to global interaction opens, it doesn't politely close behind you. It slams, lets in a draft, and brings fleas. But not all the shifts were external. Inside people, something else awakened. A hunger, not just for food or warmth, but for meaning. For art that didn't look like it belonged to someone else's afterlife. For stories, laughter, color, complexity. For something that felt alive. And that quiet tremor of wanting, that whisper of we survived, became the heartbeat of something new. The Renaissance didn't arrive like a parade. It tiptoed in like a secret. 1,000 small revolutions happening in kitchens, candlelit workshops, alley murals, and dusty libraries. The old world cracked, and through it, light leaked in. Of course, not everyone liked the light. Some longed for the familiar gloom of the old order, the comforting hierarchy, the clear rules, the illusion that someone up top still had a plan. But the survivors? They'd seen behind the curtain. They knew better. Control was a bedtime story. Stability was a costume. And life? Life was a fragile, hilarious, brutal thing that owed you nothing, and was beautiful precisely because of it. Because when you've lived through days where even sunlight felt suspicious, and you still plant something in the ground, that's not survival. That's rebellion. That's hope wearing muddy boots and a don't talk to me before coffee expression. The deepest scars are rarely visible. The Black Death didn't just rearrange cities. It rewired brains. It carved new grooves into the way people looked at each other. It whispered, everything you know can vanish mid-sentence, and people listened. Even centuries later, that whisper never really stopped. Parents still hush coughs with ancient fear. Villages still keep odd traditions like charms stitched into curtains. And every new virus carries the weight of memory like a second contagion. But that memory also came with depth. Once you've seen the world emptied, you start noticing small miracles. The way candlelight flickers across a stone wall. The breath of someone asleep beside you. Bread, still warm, breaking clean in your hand. And in many places, people didn't try to forget the plague. They built rituals to keep it close, like a ghost you've decided to feed rather than fear. Cemeteries carved skulls in stone, not to scare, but to remember. Artists painted death not as a villain but as a dance partner. Honest. Inevitable. Occasionally, fashionable. Pretending death doesn't exist doesn't make you brave. It makes you breakable. The survivors didn't want breakable. They wanted real. And real isn't always pretty, but it endures. That's why old lullabies sound more like curses. Why medieval jokes are oddly sharp. Why churches from that time are full of saints standing shoulder to shoulder with skeletons. They weren't trying to be edgy. They were trying not to waste the price they paid. Even humor changed. It got darker, yes, but also smarter. A laughter forged from knowing how bad things can get and still laughing anyway. And through it all, something miraculous bloomed. Compassion. Not the soft, hallmark kind. The dirt under your nails, sit beside the sick kind. The kind that holds a stranger's hand during their last breath. That feeds the neighbor you barely tolerate. That sings over mass graves, because silence is too heavy. Because when you've seen how fast everything can collapse, you learn that holding it together is a radical act. Especially when no one's watching. Eventually, the plague exhaled its last breath. Not with a bang, but a sigh, fading like smoke from a long, grim candle. There was no trumpet, no parade, just a day when the bells didn't ring for death. A street that stayed open. A loaf of bread baked because someone finally had flour and faith. But the plague never truly left. It burrowed into the soil of history, not as a curse, but as a teacher. A relentless, bitter, unforgettable teacher. And what it taught still echoes. That we are fragile, but not helpless. That death is real, but so is laughter. That even in the darkest dark, someone will strike a match. And even when silence feels permanent, someone, somewhere, will hum a song they don't remember learning. Because yes, the world burned. But in the ash, something wild and human and defiant took root. And it whispered back to death, with cracked lips and tired hands. Not today. It was the quiet courage to rebuild, to care, to remember. And somehow, that's what stayed. Long after the doctors stopped bleeding people like juice boxes. Long after the last pyre flickered out. Long after the rats moved on to find quieter neighborhoods with less drama. What survived? The stories. Not grand epics of kings and sword-waving legends, but of a woman who nursed strangers just because. Of a child singing lullabies to no one, simply to fill the silence. Of a father, fingers still stained with grief, planting seeds he'd never see grow. That was the real aftermath of the plague. Not just the rebirth of art, science, and a slightly more cynical economy, but the raw, cracked, imperfect rebirth of humanity. A little bruised, a little sarcastic, but real, rooted, fierce, still showing up. And in many ways, that's where we still live. In the world that was patched together by the people who didn't just survive, they remembered. So tonight, as you lie there in the quiet, or the anxiety spiral, I don't judge, just know. You're not alone in it. You're part of a long, stubborn thread. A lineage of humans who endured, who whispered stories in the dark because silence was too loud. The plague may be gone, but the story? Oh, it stayed. It always does. And yet, the Black Death wasn't the first time the Earth gave us a cosmic reality check. Long before plague ships, before quarantine prayers and plague masks that looked like rejected Halloween costumes, there was another silence. Not born of sickness, but of fire. Not a creeping shadow through city streets, but a thunderous, sky-splitting roar from under the Earth's skin. A silence that arrived with ash instead of rats. It happened in a place where laughter echoed through marble courtyards, where fountains burbled with arrogance, and wine flowed like people had never heard of moderation. A city so in love with itself, it didn't notice the mountains smirking in the background. No warning, no second chances, just a sky that blackened like overcooked toast, and a mountain that stopped pretending to nap. Pompeii. If the plague was a slow unraveling, Pompeii was a slap, a gasp, a snapshot of life paused mid-bite, mid-gossip, mid-flirtation, and then buried in volcanic concrete for 2,000 years. So let's go back. Further. Not to forget what came after, but to remember what came before. Because history doesn't always repeat itself in the same tone. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it erupts. Close your eyes. Feel the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. The rhythm of sandals on stone. The distant growl that everyone ignored because they had brunch plans. Welcome to Pompeii, the city that had no idea it was starring in its final episode. Some did try to leave, quietly, cautiously, as if sneaking out of a party that suddenly felt cursed. A few families packed their things under the cover of night, probably muttering something about bad omens or the dog won't stop barking. Slaves whispered behind walls. Merchants stalled just long enough to grab a handful of coins. But most people stayed, because leaving is hard. You've got debts, you've got drama, and frankly, you've got a really nice mosaic floor you just had installed. And besides, the mountain still looked like, well, a mountain. Harmless, decorative, even. Like it belonged on a wine label, not in a disaster. The thing about nature is, it doesn't exactly rent a megaphone. It doesn't scream. It nudges. It coughs. It clears its throat politely. And humans? We are champions of ignoring polite warnings. We build beach houses where hurricanes like to vacation. We sleep next to fault lines. We plant vineyards on volcanic slopes because the soil is just so rich. And when things do go wrong, we always act surprised, like the ground personally betrayed us. The mountain, of course, remained absolutely silent, which, ironically, was the most ominous thing it could have done. Not a single dramatic rumble. Not a plume of warning smoke. Just that unnerving, still quiet, the kind that makes even loud people whisper. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something, or someone, to move first. Some folks blamed the gods. Others blamed the weather. And the rich? They blamed inconvenience. Which, as we all know, is the final stage before the apocalypse, when the wealthiest start calling existential doom bad timing. Still, the warning signs piled up like scrolls no one read. Metallic tasting water? Strange. Skittish animals? Odd. The ground feeling? Weird? Well, that's just rustic charm, isn't it? The truth was too messy to admit, because admitting it meant packing up, saying goodbye, leaving behind the fig trees, the lovers, the gossip, and no one wants to evacuate right before market day. And so, people stayed. Because that's what we do. We stay. Until the sky rips open and makes the decision for us. It began with a sound no one could quite describe, which is never a great sign. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It was deeper, older. The kind of sound that makes your bones stiffen and your ancestors turn over in their graves. It was as if the earth, after centuries of politely holding its tongue, finally said, enough. At first, everyone just looked up. Because that's what you do when things fall apart. You check the sky, as if divine weather updates are going to help. The heavens, once blue and unbothered, had suddenly turned the color of bad bruises and worse decisions. Ash smeared across the horizon like someone had taken a dirty cloth to the sun. Birds, usually so full of judgmental commentary, vanished. Not a flap, not a chirp, just gone. And then came the rain. Not the good kind, not even the wet kind. Stones, sharp, hot, and deeply personal. First it was pebbles, like the mountain was testing its aim. Then came the real stuff, rocks that cracked roofs, shattered windows, and sent people sprinting for cover using whatever was handy. Baskets, pots, or, in one tragic case, an entire roast duck. By mid-morning, the sun had filed for resignation. Gone. The ash turned day into night and then kept going. Lamps were lit. How cute, but they barely fought back. The air thickened. The ash wasn't soft or poetic. It was aggressive. It didn't just fall. It invaded. It clawed into mouths, wormed its way into lungs, erased the familiar edges of everything. Pompeii, once a city of color and chaos, became a charcoal sketch of itself. Silent, blurred, gasping, people ran, or tried to, down alleys that had never felt narrower. Toward the sea, which, spoiler alert, was not feeling cooperative. Toward the countryside, where they hoped the mountain's rage might get bored. Chaos bloomed. Carts overturned. Donkeys panicked. Parents screamed for children. And some people, the very tired, the very old, the very done, just sat down. Not everyone runs when the world ends. Some people just pause. And Vesuvius? Oh, it wasn't finished. Not even close. It kept going, like a performer on their final, fiery encore. A tantrum in geological form. Pyroclastic flows, which is just a fancy way of saying death clouds full of hot murder, tore down the mountain. Not walking, not jogging, sprinting, faster than thought, faster than fear. Inside homes, people did what people do. They hid, under tables, behind curtains, inside cellars, as if modest furniture could negotiate with volcanic fury. Some tied cloths around their mouths, hoping to filter out destruction like it was a dusty afternoon. It didn't work. The ash didn't care. It slid through cracks, prayers, and denial like it had RSVP'd to dinner and wasn't leaving. Time warped. Minutes felt like forever. Some scribbled final messages on walls, dramatic last lines that probably would have gone viral. Others just held each other, which, honestly, might have been the best option. One man clutched a bag of coins, because of course he did. Another knelt, probably mid-bargain with gods who had clearly taken the day off. And then came the silence. Again. Thick, unnatural. Not peace, aftermath. Pompeii wasn't a city anymore. It was a shadow, a snapshot, a moment held in volcanic suspension. Life, mid-breath, mid-meal, mid-goodbye, but it didn't happen all at once. Oh no, Vesuvius had range. The eruption came in waves, as if the mountain was giving everyone a chance to reflect on their life choices between each surge of doom. Moments of false calm were just part of the show. You'd think it was over, breathe a little, maybe even peek out from under the table, and boom, round two. Classic volcanic misdirection. Some people, bless their optimism, thought it would stop. That maybe it was just a particularly moody thunderstorm, or the gods letting off steam, or some minor hiccup in the cosmic plumbing. Denial, it's not just a river in Egypt. It's a survival tactic, a very ineffective one, in this case. But Vesuvius wasn't interested in subtlety. Its message was loud, clear, and very much on fire. By nightfall, the city that once overflowed with wine, gossip, and questionable poetry was gone. Buried. Smothered beneath a blanket of ash and pumice. Like a child trying to hide a mess under the rug. Only the mess was 20 feet deep and permanent. Homes turned into tombs. Bodies into statues. Time itself froze, like even the clock was too stunned to keep ticking. Pompeii didn't collapse with ceremony or closure. It was cut off, mid-laugh, mid-loaf of bread, mid-flirtation in the marketplace. And beneath all that ash, somewhere, someone's final heartbeat echoed once, then never again. There's a strange quiet that comes when death doesn't bother explaining itself. Pompeii wasn't taken down by war or politics or years of slow decline. It was interrupted, stopped mid-scene, mid-line, without even the courtesy of a dramatic fade-out. And in that brutal interruption, something bizarre happened. It was preserved. Not just the buildings, though yes, those too, but the moments. The mid-everythings. The things no one ever expects to be their last. Half-eaten figs, messy beds, graffiti that probably said something wildly inappropriate. Pompeii didn't just leave ruins. It left human fingerprints on history. Archaeologists didn't unearth ruins. They uncovered reactions, responses, snapshots of panic frozen in volcanic time. A man face down, shielding his head like it mattered. A woman curled around her belly, as if fear could be cradled. A child, knees tucked in, trying to shrink into nothingness. These weren't sculptures. They were stories, paused mid-sentence. Human instinct, fossilized in real time. And what were they clinging to? Coins, rings, tools. Because even when the sky is falling and the air is poison, we're still thinking, better bring the silverware, just in case. We reach for what feels valuable, which usually says more about us than we'd like. Some were simply holding each other, not for safety, because by then, safety had already packed up and left, but because even when the world ends, we're still embarrassingly sentimental. Lovers, friends, strangers, it didn't matter. The last gesture was touch, because when all else fails, we reach for warmth. Or maybe for proof that someone else is still real. And the animals? They didn't get a warning either. Dogs were found mid-yelp, still chained in courtyards. Birds frozen mid-flap in their cages. A mule collapsed near a cart, harnessed and faithful until the last breath. Vesuvius didn't care if you barked, clucked, or paid taxes. Nature doesn't check credentials. It just shows up, uninvited and unstoppable. The details are obscene in their intimacy. Folded tunics, sandals on feet, teeth clenched, fingernails dug into stone, as if the earth itself might show mercy if you just gripped it hard enough. Spoiler, it didn't. There was no swelling music, no climactic final speech, no noble sacrifice. Just a city, silenced. Thousands of final heartbeats, still echoing in the void they left behind. And somehow, even in all that horror, there's something painfully beautiful. Not postcard beautiful. More like the kind that grabs you by the chest and says, look, this is what it means to be fragile. Pompeii is proof that even stone cities and loud people can be undone in one exhale. And that sometimes, just sometimes, what's left behind tells the truth more clearly than what survived. Because memory doesn't always need language. Sometimes it just needs shape. Dust. A wine cup knocked sideways. A loaf of bread still in the oven. A doorway, half open, leading nowhere. It turns out history doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes, it wears sandals. Sometimes it trips over the cat and leaves rude drawings on the bathroom wall. Because what Pompeii truly saved wasn't just evidence of how people died. It was proof of how they lived. Imperfectly, loudly, messily, like us. There were bakeries with loaves still fossilized in ovens. Because when your last act on earth is baking bread, you deserve to be remembered. There were wine jugs labeled with prices. Because capitalism never sleeps, not even during volcanic apocalypses. And yes, there were brothels, complete with paintings on the walls that leave very little to the imagination and remind us that family-friendly was never really part of ancient zoning laws. It's funny, in a morbid kind of way. We often think of ancient civilizations as noble, austere, impossibly dignified. But Pompeii throws a banana peel under that pedestal and says, actually, people have always been ridiculous. They argued about money. They gossiped about neighbors. They doodled on walls. They chased dogs. They flirted. They got bored. They lived. And for once, that's what history decided to remember. Not the emperor's decree. Not the military campaign. But a boy's footprint in the dust. A table still set for dinner. A hallway echoing with a joke no one got to finish. That's the brilliance of it, and the heartbreak. Pompeii didn't give us closure. It gave us interruption. A city frozen mid-chapter, with all the noise and nonsense of life still hanging in the air. And somehow, that makes it more human than all the marble statues and Latin inscriptions put together. Because when you look closely, not just at the objects, but at the spaces between them, you realize something unsettling. This wasn't supposed to be found. These weren't exhibits. They were leftovers. Not curated. Not posed. Just left. And maybe that's why it resonates so deeply. Because in a world obsessed with polishing the past, Pompeii hands us something raw. Something unedited. Something too honest to be comfortable. A moment when the world forgot to lie, and in that forgetting, told the truth. It's a truth we rarely get from history books. That people don't vanish in grand finales. They vanish in routines. In yawns. In mid-bite. In the middle of feeding the cat or arguing about dinner. And sometimes, what they leave behind isn't wisdom carved in stone. It's a shopping list and a half-finished joke. So the next time you pass a cracked wall or hear silence that feels too loud, think of Pompeii. Think of the city that got paused instead of erased. Think of the lives that didn't get a proper ending, but somehow still managed to leave a beginning for the rest of us. Because beneath all that ash and time and tragedy, Pompeii isn't just a warning. It's a mirror, and it's still looking right back at us. Pompeii didn't preserve Rome's glory. It preserved its gossip. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? To know that while emperors were off conquering provinces and commissioning statues of their own chins, regular folks in Pompeii were too busy drawing questionable stick figures and arguing about who stole whose goat. Turns out humanity wasn't built on greatness. It was built on neighborhood drama and bad handwriting. And that's the beauty of it. When you walk those streets, or look at the plaster casts, or the faded frescoes of overly enthusiastic Venus worshippers, you're not stepping into history. You're stepping into a conversation that got rudely interrupted. A joke with no punchline. A love letter that never got a reply. Pompeii isn't a monument. It's a voicemail from the past that just says, "Hey, we were here too." Even their graffiti was honest. Brutally so. Some inscriptions are romantic. Some are offensive. Some are just confused. One wall literally says, "I don't like you." Another says, "Successus was here." Another, Apollinaris, the doctor of the emperor, defecated well here. A proud moment, no doubt. And you realize, these people weren't trying to be remembered. They were just trying to live. And somehow, that's what made them unforgettable. Because Pompeii doesn't inspire awe in the way giant temples or glorious battlefields do. It inspires something quieter, stranger, more familiar, a sort of awkward recognition. You look at those ruins and think, oh no, that's me. You see your mess, your clutter, your unfinished plans, preserved forever under a sky that didn't ask for permission. And yet, for all its chaos, Pompeii offers something oddly rare in the history of civilization: intimacy without pretense. You're not reading about kings from afar. You're in someone's backyard. You're peeking into their pantry. You're standing where they stood, seeing what they saw, before the sky fell. And in that eerie closeness, in that ash-covered familiarity, something ancient and uncomfortable settles in. A reminder that what we think of as normal life is always one breath away from not being life at all. So the next time the ground feels steady and the mountain looks calm, maybe don't get too comfortable. Because if Pompeii taught us anything, it's that normal doesn't last. Not really. Not forever. And sometimes, history isn't a lecture. It's a whisper in the walls, a scribble on the bathroom door, a loaf of bread that never got eaten. It's the sound of everything being fine, right before it isn't. And that's what made it revolutionary. Not the ash, not the science, not even the skeletons clutching wine jugs, but the fact that, for once, history stopped quoting emperors and started eavesdropping on bakers. Pompeii didn't hand the microphone to Julius Caesar. It passed it to a guy who overslept, burned his bread, and probably blamed Mercury retrograde. And ironically, that's exactly why we remember him. Every charred loaf, every cracked jug, every frozen mid-sneeze statue is a sentence in a long-forgotten group chat. That loaf of bread still in the oven? A missed dinner. That glass bottle? Someone's favorite cup. That ring still on a finger? A love story that did not sign up for a dramatic ending, and certainly not one involving lava. For scientists, it became a volcanic playground. Geologists ran around mapping flows. Forensic experts squinted at ancient dental work. And volcanologists finally had something more exciting to study than dormant craters. Pompeii was a full-course meal of horror, preserved in high definition. No footnotes, no spin, just the unfiltered chaos of real life hitting the fan. But Pompeii wasn't just science, it was drama. Art school kids with charcoal pencils descended on the ruins like it was the next big gallery opening. Poets got emotional about crumbling doorways. Everyone tried to capture the vibe. And the vibe, frankly, was everything is temporary, especially you. Then came the tourists. Oh, the tourists. Shuffling through ancient bedrooms in baseball caps. Taking selfies next to plastered remains with captions like hot stuff. Cameras flashing in places where people didn't just die. They lived, they gossiped, they tripped over sandals and yelled at their kids. Pompeii is that rare historical site that says, yes, be reverent, but also, maybe don't lick the frescoes. You walk those streets and the past doesn't whisper, it breathes down your neck. There's this bizarre feeling that someone just left the room. That if you turned fast enough, you'd catch the edge of a tunic vanishing around the corner, muttering about the price of figs. Pompeii stopped being a tragedy and became a mirror. It didn't ask for pity, it asked for awareness. It reminded us that civilization is a Jenga tower we built on a sleeping volcano. That our normal is a temporary arrangement with nature, and nature has a very short attention span. It showed us that all the apps, satellites, and self-cleaning toilets in the world won't save us from the simple truth. We are soft creatures with wildly inflated calendars, and all of it, the bills, the brunches, the skincare routines, can end before lunch. But it also whispered something softer, something you only hear if you're paying attention. That memory isn't loud. It's a footprint, a dent in a cushion, a half-buttoned tunic. That telling these stories isn't just about curiosity, it's about humility. Because maybe if we remember clearly enough, we won't need the mountain to remind us again. The strange thing about Pompeii is that it doesn't just shout death. It taps you on the shoulder and goes, hey, real quick. What were you doing 5 minutes before your life got weird? And then it stares. Were you folding laundry? Stress scrolling? Arguing with a refrigerator? Pompeii turns those tiny, forgettable moments into relics. It makes you wonder, what's your carbonized bread loaf going to be? We hate that question. It's annoying. It slows us down. And we're not great with slowing down. We hustle while drinking burnout smoothies. We fall asleep to productivity podcasts. We multitask brushing teeth and checking crypto. But Pompeii doesn't care about your hustle. Pompeii wants you to sit down, to shut up, to notice the crack in the wall and the sound your cat makes when it's dreaming. It wants you to remember that stillness is not surrender. It's awareness. Because while the people of Pompeii didn't get to choose stillness, it was forced on them, we still can. We can lie down and let the to-do list wait. We can let our shoulders drop, our screens dim, our minds drift. That, oddly enough, might be the only thing they'd ask of us. Rest while you can, before the mountain starts clearing its throat. So tonight, as you lie there, eyes heavy, heartbeat slowing, remember Pompeii. Not as a place that died, but as a place that paused, mid-joke, mid-meal, mid-mess. And if you're still here, listening, not rushing, not refreshing your inbox, then congratulations. You've done something they didn't get to. You've arrived at the now. And in this rare, quiet now, maybe just stay for a minute. That's the lesson. Not urgency, but presence. Because if the mountain ever decides to speak again, and it will, let it find us listening. Pompeii didn't ask to be remembered. It didn't commission a statue or hire a bard. It didn't carve its legacy into marble. It just paused, mid-breath, mid-thought. And because that pause lasted a little longer than expected, say, 2,000 years, someone eventually noticed. And somehow, that was enough. Enough to turn ash into echo, stillness into meaning, a geological accident into a cultural epiphany. We like to think of endings as dramatic, violins, slow motion, a last-minute confession. But Pompeii didn't do drama. It vanished politely, without fanfare. No standing ovation, no curtain call. Just a soft exit, stage left. And in that quiet disappearance, it reminded us that the stories that last aren't always the ones that scream. Sometimes, they're the ones that whisper, very, very slowly, from just beneath the surface. And you listened. You listened to merchants who never finished haggling, to mothers who never finished scolding, to sandals that never got tied, to a city that left mid-sentence and never came back to finish the paragraph. You followed the ash-lined footprints. You stood in the silence. You stared at the wall where someone once doodled something wildly inappropriate. And for a moment, you weren't in the present at all. You were in theirs. But here's the thing, this wasn't really about them. It was about you. Your rush. Your routines. Your breath that barely makes it past your collarbone before being chased by the next notification. Pompeii, for all its silence, held up a mirror. Not a dramatic one, no funhouse distortions. Just a simple reflection. You, distracted, busy, forgetting to notice you're alive. So maybe, just for tonight, you let the ruins rest. Let the gods mumble to themselves. Let the ash settle, not on your skin, but on your calendar. You are here. You are safe. And unlike Pompeii, you still get to choose silence. Maybe this is your cue. Not to fear a curse. Not to tiptoe around ancient gods. Just to pause. To remember that real power doesn't shout. It waits. Picture the desert at dawn. Cold sand. A sky still unsure if it's morning. And somewhere in the distance, a silence that hasn't been disturbed in over 3,000 years. We're in Egypt now, but not the Egypt of pyramids and tour buses. This is the Valley of the Kings, a graveyard carved into cliffs, where the walls remember, even when we forget. Buried deep beneath the stone, beneath centuries of wind and footsteps and carelessness, there is a tomb, a door, a boy, A story that was never meant to be found. And yet, here we are. Tutankhamun. The name echoes now like it's always meant something. A golden mask. A curse. A museum ticket. But for most of history, that name was a whisper, or less than that. He ruled briefly, died young, and was buried like a question nobody had the energy to answer. His tomb wasn't grand. It wasn't planned. It was more of a royal storage closet. You can almost hear the palace staff muttering, "Just pick a spot. Any spot. Pharaoh number what now?" They slid him into a chamber barely big enough for a decent afterlife. No cosmic murals. No star maps. No look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Just tight walls, reused decorations, and a growing layer of dust. And that, ironically, is what saved him. While the flashy pharaohs got buried in monuments so large they screamed "rob me," Tutankhamun was ignored. He didn't matter enough to loot. And so, for over 3,000 years, he was left alone. Unloved, untouched, unbothered, which is more than most kings, or influencers, can say. Then came 1922. Howard Carter, British archaeologist. Part Indiana Jones, part office clerk. He had been digging in the Valley of the Kings for years, funded by Lord Carnarvon, a man whose hobbies included race cars, imperialism, and accidentally funding the most iconic find of the 20th century. Carter was about to lose his funding when his team uncovered a staircase buried beneath rubble. At the bottom, a sealed door, still intact, still marked with royal seals, still saying, in very ancient and very clear terms, "Do not enter." Naturally, they entered. Carter peeked through a small hole in the wall, held a candle, and said the now iconic words, "I see wonderful things," which, in British archaeologist terms, translates roughly to "Holy *T." Behind that door wasn't just treasure. It was a time capsule. Chariots, thrones, jewelry, perfume, linen, fruit. Basically a teenager's bedroom, if that teenager had unlimited gold and a deeply unhealthy relationship with the concept of immortality. And in the center of it all, the sarcophagus, nested like a Russian doll made of gold. Gold, inside another layer of holy gold. At the heart, the body of a boy. Tutankhamun, still lying in the dark, waiting for someone to either let him sleep or finally turn off the light. Of course, the modern world didn't just turn on the light. It brought cameras, reporters, curators, souvenir shops. Tutankhamun wasn't rediscovered. He was rebranded. The quiet, forgotten king became a global phenomenon. Not for his policies, not for his character, but for what he left behind. Gold, mystery, a face carved into eternity. And while the world stared at his treasures, posed next to his coffins, and whispered about his curse, nobody asked the simplest question. What if he just wanted to be left alone? Because the thing is, this wasn't a story about magic or revenge. It was about disturbance. About a boy who died quietly and was awakened loudly by a civilization that never learned how to enter a room without knocking the walls down. And somewhere, beneath all the dust and velvet ropes and gift shop postcards, the tomb still waits. Tutankhamun. The name rolls off the tongue now like a legend. Heavy, ancient, golden. But in his own time, he was barely a footnote. A placeholder pharaoh. The kind of king history only remembers by accident. And in this case, it really was an accident. If his tomb hadn't been missed by grave robbers and colonial archaeologists alike, chances are we'd be calling him that boy who reigned during a scheduling conflict, if we mentioned him at all. He came to power around the age of 9, which, in pharaonic terms, is not ideal. Imagine being handed the responsibility of maintaining the spiritual, political, and agricultural stability of the world, and you still have a loose baby tooth. His reign began not because he was ready, but because someone had to sit on the throne. And, as far as anyone can tell, he sat very quietly. His father, Akhenaten, had shaken Egypt to its religious foundations. He tried to erase centuries of polytheism and declared the sun god Aten as the one and only divine being, sort of like rebooting a very old operating system and pretending the bugs were features. The people hated it. The priests hated it more. And when Akhenaten died, the old gods came back with a vengeance, carrying receipts. Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, was placed on the throne as the clean-up crew. His first royal act? Change his name to show he was Team Amun again. If ancient Egypt had Twitter, this would have been the equivalent of deleting your dad's controversial thread and issuing a generic apology. He reversed his father's religious reforms, restored temples, and tried to act like nothing weird had happened. Which, in fairness, is exactly what any teenager would do if they inherited a cultural crisis. Just fix it was probably the extent of his mandate. He didn't build monuments. He didn't launch conquests. He mostly tried to mess what had already been messed. And then he died. At 19. Not in battle. Not assassinated. Just died. Maybe from malaria. Maybe from a congenital disorder. Maybe from the simple fact that royalty and genetics don't always mix well after several centuries of keeping it in the family. His burial was rushed. No custom tomb. No grand fanfare. The builders grabbed whatever tomb was available, reused decorations from older kings, shoved things into corners, and tried to make it all look intentional. You know, like when guests are arriving and you're still vacuuming in your pajamas. He was buried, sealed, forgotten, erased from official king lists. No temples were raised in his honor. No festivals. No songs. Just silence, and maybe, depending on who you ask, relief. Because Tutankhamun represented a strange time. A religious civil war. A royal embarrassment. And when you're an empire trying to move forward, sometimes the best thing to do is forget. So they did. And yet, ironically, it was that erasure that saved him. The kings who mattered, who built grand tombs and demanded eternal fame, were robbed blind within decades. But Tutankhamun, buried quietly, mattered so little that nobody bothered. Which meant his tomb remained undisturbed, unopened, unseen, until a man with a mustache and a very British determination decided to poke around. The boy they tried to delete became the most famous pharaoh of all time. His name is now printed on books, museums, mugs, and fridge magnets. And somewhere, in whatever version of the afterlife the Egyptians got right, Tutankhamun is probably still trying to understand how this all got so wildly out of hand. The king no one wanted to remember became impossible to forget. Not because of what he did, but because of what we found, and what we refused to leave alone. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings had been thoroughly picked over. Tombs had been opened, looted, catalogued, photographed. It was like an ancient shopping mall after a clearance sale, mostly empty shelves and faded grandeur. Archaeologists, grave robbers, and adventurers had all taken their turn. So when Howard Carter showed up with his brushes, notebooks, and a dwindling budget, most people assumed he was about to dig himself into professional obscurity. But Carter was stubborn and methodical. He wasn't interested in chasing rumors or treasure maps. He believed, with annoying consistency, that something had been missed. Somewhere beneath the dust, rocks, and centuries of human error, a forgotten tomb still waited. A minor king, perhaps. A misplaced burial. Something overlooked. Enter Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy British aristocrat who enjoyed racing cars, raising eyebrows, and funding archaeological digs in places he didn't fully understand. Carnarvon had the money. Carter had the obsession. And so, the two of them formed the most unlikely buddy drama in the history of ancient studies. By 1922, the money was nearly gone. The workers were exhausted. Even Carter was beginning to wonder if he'd simply rearranged an entire desert for nothing. And then, a step. Literally, just a carved stone step, barely visible under the rubble. Followed by another. And another. At the bottom of the staircase, a sealed door. still intact, still marked with the royal cartouche, still practically screaming, "Last chance to turn back." Naturally, they went in. Carter famously made a small hole, peered in with a candle, and whispered, "Yes, wonderful things." Which is the polite version of what he probably said. Behind the door wasn't just a tomb. It was a sealed time capsule, one that Egypt had forgotten, and the rest of the world wasn't ready for. The room was chaos in the most elegant sense. Gold everywhere. Furniture piled like someone had moved out in a hurry. Chariots, thrones, statues, game boards, linen, jewelry, everything Tutankhamun might need for the afterlife, assuming the afterlife was a hoarder's garage. And in the middle of it all, the sarcophagus, or rather, the series of sarcophagi, like nesting dolls, each one shinier and more excessive than the last. At the heart of the gold-on-gold extravaganza, the boy himself, mummified, masked. Still, the world lost its mind. Newspapers printed every possible detail. Artists rendered every object with breathless reverence. And somewhere between Cairo and London, a curse was born. Not an actual one, of course. Just the kind of Gothic nonsense that happens when rich men die mysteriously and journalists get bored. Carnarvon, shortly after entering the tomb, was bitten by a mosquito. The bite got infected. He died. Cue the headlines, "The Curse of the Pharaoh Strikes." Never mind the fact that ancient tombs are full of mold, dust, bacteria, and sharp edges. No, clearly it was the mummy's wrath. Because nothing sells like fear wrapped in linen. The myth spread like wildfire. Lights went out across Cairo the night Carnarvon died. His dog supposedly howled and dropped dead back in England. And just like that, Tutankhamun wasn't just a king. He was a ghost, a celebrity, a marketing opportunity. And Carter? He lived for another 16 years. No curse, no drama, just cataloging, translating, and silently wondering how his life's work had turned into a tourist attraction with keychains. The tomb was eventually emptied, piece by piece, boxed and shipped and displayed. And the silence that had lasted 3,000 years was replaced by flash photography and museum audio guides. Let's talk about the curse. Because of course there was a curse. There's always a curse. You don't dig up a dead teenager from 1325 BCE, haul his stuff across continents, and not expect the public to start whispering about supernatural revenge. It's basically the mummy version of bad Yelp reviews, except in hieroglyphs. But here's the twist. There wasn't one. No inscriptions on the tomb walls warned intruders. No scrolls dripped with divine threats. No ancient priest standing outside yelling, "I told you so." And yet, the legend exploded. Lord Carnarvon's mosquito bite, which, by the way, got infected because he shaved over it with a dirty razor, was enough to launch 1,000 conspiracy theories. His dog dying back in England? Unconfirmed. The lights going out in Cairo the night he died? Likely a power outage. But once the media caught the scent of drama, facts didn't stand a chance. It was the 1920s, a golden age of flappers, jazz, and deeply questionable journalism. Headlines screamed about the mummy's curse while newspapers sold out overnight. The public was thrilled. Mystery, death, ancient gods with a grudge. It was all so much more interesting than, say, the actual life of Tutankhamun. Howard Carter, ever the realist, was unimpressed. He famously rolled his eyes at the idea of curses and continued his work. No dramatic fainting spells. No swarms of locusts. Just cataloging artifacts and dodging sensationalist reporters. And yet, the deaths piled up, or so it seemed. A few people who entered the tomb did die in the years that followed. From natural causes. From illnesses that had nothing to do with magic or pharaohs or divine vengeance. But once the narrative was in place, every stubbed toe became a tragedy foretold. You know how it is. You buy a new car and suddenly you see that car everywhere. It's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. Now apply that to death by mummy and a few well-timed funerals, and voila, you've got yourself a global haunting. Some researchers even tried to give the curse a scientific veneer. They blamed ancient bacteria, toxic mold, radiation from decaying materials. Which, let's be honest, is a very unromantic way to die. But much more plausible than being smited by Osiris because you took selfies in his house. And yet, the idea refused to die. Even today, tourists still whisper about the curse. Hollywood has built entire franchises around it. Because curses sell. Sarcophagi? Less so. It says a lot about us, doesn't it? That we're more willing to believe in an ancient hex than in historical neglect. We'd rather imagine a pharaoh's wrath than face the truth. That a teenage boy died, was forgotten, and then had his resting place turned into a spectacle. The real tragedy isn't the curse. It's that we turned a burial into entertainment. That we made horror where there was only dust, and fear where there was only silence. Tutankhamun didn't curse anyone. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't request that his afterlife include glass cases and audio guides. He was just a kid, sealed in gold, hoping to go unnoticed for eternity. Instead, we dragged him back into the spotlight, gave him movie roles, sold his face on tote bags, and then, when strange things happened, we blamed him. Because it's easier to fear a curse than to admit we're the ones disturbing the dead. What happens when your afterlife becomes someone else's souvenir? Tutankhamun didn't build empires. He didn't lead armies. He wasn't even particularly good at staying alive. He died around 19. And yet, somehow, he became the face of ancient Egypt. Not Ramses. Not Hatshepsut. Not Akhenaten with his alien-shaped head. Tut, the boy king, the golden teenager. But not as a person. As a brand. After the tomb was opened, the artifacts were studied, admired, and then packed. Packed and shipped and displayed in museums that never asked permission. Tutankhamun toured the world like a rock star, except he didn't get royalties, applause, or even a say. Just strangers staring at his things while eating overpriced museum snacks. In London, the exhibit drew millions. People lined up for hours to see a mask. Not a speech. Not a story. A mask. The world was hypnotized by the gold, the symmetry, the eyes that didn't blink. Because nothing says sacred burial like a gift shop around the corner. Tutmania swept the globe. Scarabs on t-shirts. Ankhs in jewelry stores. You could decorate your bathroom in Egyptian chic. And no one paused to ask, is this admiration or exploitation? Meanwhile, in Egypt, there were protests. Why, some asked, was the boy king flying around the world while his country struggled to protect its heritage? Why did his tomb become a tourist hotspot, while local history was left in bureaucratic limbo? But gold speaks louder than guardianship. And Tut had become too valuable to stay dead. His face appeared on coins. His name on documentaries, video games, notebooks, lunchboxes. He was everywhere, except in his own narrative. No one asked who he was, what he feared, what he loved, only what he wore when he died. Museums called it education. Journalists called it fascination. But it was really just commodification. We turned a boy's grave into a backdrop. We called it culture, but it looked a lot like theft. Even now, his story is told with more glitter than grief, more gold than truth, because sadness doesn't sell, and reverence doesn't trend. And Tut? Still silent, still masked, still passed around, from one city to the next, like a borrowed memory. His legacy should have been peace. Instead, it's merchandise. A legacy in a glass case. Lit from below. Watched. Photographed. Repackaged for the next audience. And maybe that's what haunts us. Not a curse. Not a plague. But a faint sense that we've crossed a line. That somewhere along the way, we stopped honoring the dead. And started using them. Strip away the gold. Take off the lapis lazuli, the obsidian inlays, the ceremonial daggers. Set aside the linen wrappings and the lotus-shaped amulets. What you're left with is a body. Thin, fragile, damaged. A teenage boy, barely grown. Spine curved, teeth uneven, left foot deformed. Tutankhamun wasn't a god. He wasn't even well. CT scans show a fractured leg, possibly from a fall. He may have had a clubfoot. He likely walked with a cane, or several. Dozens were found in his tomb, not as symbols, as necessities. He was a king carried through ceremonies he couldn't walk into. Imagine that. Worshipped as divine, but needing help to stand. Told you are the living god Horus, but unable to climb stairs. Adorned in gold, but wincing with each step. A life built on ritual and illusion, and pain. We romanticize pharaohs as titans, commanders of armies, builders of wonders. But Tutankhamun was a boy with a limp, a likely infection, and no choice in anything that happened to him. He was a prop in someone else's political reset, a figurehead for restoration, a name to fix a narrative. Did he have friends? Did he laugh? Did he get angry when his food was cold? Did he love the sound of a certain bird in the garden? We don't know, because we never asked. We were too busy measuring the gold thread on his sandals. His skull was once thought to show signs of trauma. A blow to the head, perhaps. Murder? Conspiracy? More headlines. More documentaries. But later analysis suggested it was damage from modern handling. We broke him, then blamed history. It's strange, isn't it? We talk about his treasures, his secrets, his curse. But rarely about his fear, his loneliness, his death, likely sudden and painful. At 19, he ruled during a turbulent time. Religious wars, national confusion. He had a wife, his half-sister, 2 daughters, stillborn. Their tiny coffins were placed beside him, tucked into the corners of his tomb like forgotten thoughts. And yet, when we tell his story, we begin with the mask. The sparkle. The mystery. Never the human. Maybe we're afraid to see ourselves in him. A boy burdened with expectations he never asked for. Dressed in power he never wielded. Dying quietly in a palace filled with people who needed him alive, but not too alive. So the mask stayed on. In life, in death, in history, and now, in every museum, every coffee table book, every bedtime documentary, we still refuse to look past it. But if you did, if you looked past the gold leaf and the cobra on his brow, you'd see a scared kid, forced to play immortal. And you might just feel something sharp and uncomfortable in your chest. Something like guilt, or recognition, because we all wear masks, some shinier than others, and some, like his, too heavy to ever take off. It's easy to think Tutankhamun was always famous. He's the pharaoh now, the one on posters, in puzzles, on postage stamps. But for over 3,000 years, he was nobody. Not a legend, not a mystery. Just another sealed tomb in a sunburned valley that no one cared to visit. Because the truth is, Tutankhamun wasn't just buried once. He was erased. After his death, his name was scrubbed from monuments. His successor, took credit for the tomb's construction. His stepfather's religious revolution, the whole reason for Tut's sudden reign, was reversed. And with that came a sweeping, systematic cleanup. A PR campaign so aggressive it could have been managed by a modern political strategist. The temples were rebranded, the gods restored, and Tutankhamun, that fragile teenager who had tried to steady the ship, was quietly cut from the official record. Not with violence, not with curses, but with silence. In ancient Egypt, being forgotten was worse than death. To die was one thing. To be erased from memory, that was exile from eternity. No one carved poems for him. No statues in his honor. No scrolls preserving his wisdom, because he didn't live long enough to write any. He disappeared, tucked into a makeshift tomb smaller than his station should have allowed. No pyramids, no colonnades, just a carved hill and a locked door. And maybe that's why the discovery hit so hard in 1922. Because it wasn't just a tomb. It was an accident of history. A forgotten boy who was supposed to stay forgotten suddenly became the loudest name in the ancient world. But even then, did we really resurrect him? Or just the stuff around him? Because while the world marveled at the sarcophagus, no one was asking why his name had to be rediscovered in the first place. Why this king was left out of the parades of pharaohs we teach in school. His burial was hasty. His tomb reused. Some of his treasures? Clearly recycled. Even the gold mask may have originally belonged to someone else, possibly a woman. He was pharaoh, yes, but a pharaoh on clearance. A placeholder in the grand dynastic timeline. The history books skipped him, until Howard Carter made him impossible to ignore. So Tutankhamun was buried twice. Once by the priests and kings who wanted to forget him, and again by us, who only remembered what glittered. We didn't honor his legacy. We Monetized his mystery. We didn't tell his story. We sold the props. And maybe, if he's watching from some realm of afterlife, he's not angry, not cursed, just tired. Tired of being either erased or misunderstood. And now that we've exhumed him, from stone and silence and spin, maybe it's time we buried the myth. And finally, remembered the person. Tombs are supposed to be quiet. That's kind of the point. They're built for silence, for breathless stillness, for memories whispered, not monetized. But Tutankhamun's tomb? It became loud. Not in volume, perhaps, but in energy, in attention, in flashing cameras and gasps from tourists clutching their sun hats and water bottles. People whispered, yes, but only because they were told to. Not out of reverence, out of protocol. And in that silence, buzzing earbuds, shutter clicks, museum descents trying to keep a straight face while explaining why there are Hello Kitty souvenirs 2 booths down from the Book of the Dead replicas. The tomb became a circus without elephants. Just mummies, mystery, and merchandise. A sacred grave turned into a stage. One where the star no longer had lines, but still drew the crowds. It didn't happen all at once. First came the discovery, then the excavation, then the tomb tours, carefully curated, highly controlled, and eventually, the recreations. Because the real tomb was too delicate, too sacred, too fragile to be visited by everyone. So we built copies. That's right, we built copies of a grave. So more people could experience what death feels like, with better lighting and air conditioning. There's something unsettling about it. About staring into a room where a boy once rested for 3,000 years, and then walking out to grab a latte. We leave these places moved, inspired, and then check Instagram in the parking lot. Maybe that's the modern curse. Not death, not misfortune, but dilution. Taking something profound and flattening it into content. We turned the tomb into a backdrop. 4 documentaries. 4 photos. 4 TikToks. Hey guys, Today I'm standing in front of King Tut's sarcophagus. Don't forget to like and subscribe. No wonder the ancient Egyptians believed in spells to guard the dead. Not to ward off spirits, but tourists. And through it all, the boy still lies there. Still in the same cramped chamber. Still surrounded by the objects meant to guide him through the afterlife. Except now, those objects are labels in a gift shop or icons in a slideshow. He never asked for this. He didn't crave fame. He didn't crave anything, except maybe comfort, maybe peace. And now, he gets neither. Because his tomb, once sealed with sacred ritual, is now a place of performance. A script we keep rewriting, each time louder, glossier, emptier. And maybe the saddest part? We call it education. We call it culture. But sometimes, a grave should just be a grave, not a brand. They prayed to many gods. Ra, Osiris, Anubis, Isis. Gods with falcon heads, jackal masks, wings, scales. Gods for the sun, for death, for rebirth, for mummification, for farming, for dreams, for nightmares. There was no shortage of divine departments. And for every offering left on a temple floor, there was a whispered hope. Please, hear me. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Tutankhamun still died. Despite the rituals, despite the incense, despite the elaborate funeral texts, the carved spells, the holy oils imported from exotic lands. He died young, sick, and surrounded by silence. The gods didn't answer. Or maybe they did, and the answer was no. Or worse, nothing. We've built religions on less. Entire philosophies around absence. But for ancient Egyptians, this kind of divine quiet must have been terrifying. They believed in balance. In Marat, cosmic order. If you lived right, honored the gods, preserved the rituals, things would make sense. But Tut's story? It doesn't. A child king, a political pawn, a damaged body, a rushed burial, and now, eternal fame for reasons he never chose. Where's the symmetry in that? Did Anubis look away? Did Osiris forget to open the door? Or was this the point all along? That the gods were never meant to speak, only to be spoken to? Silence can be comforting. It can also be cruel. Because it forces us to fill in the blanks. To tell ourselves that there's meaning, even when there isn't. And so we did. We filled the void with stories. Curses, gold, romance, conspiracies. We treated the unanswered questions like Mad Libs. Insert drama here. Because the alternative? That a teenage boy died pointlessly, and the gods said nothing? That's not a bedtime story. That's just life. But maybe there's something honest in that. Maybe the gods don't whisper back because they're waiting for us to stop asking and start listening. To what? To the silence. To each other. To the fact that we all die. And most of us aren't lucky enough to be found again. In a way, Tutankhamun became divine not because the gods chose him, but because he outlasted their relevance. He's remembered more than Ra. He has more museum merch than Isis. He's on more t-shirts than Horus. And what does that say about us? Maybe gods don't disappear. They just change shape. And now they look like algorithms. Tour groups. Hashtags. Exhibits with gift shops at the end. The gods are quiet. But we never stopped talking. He waited. In that carved-out chamber. Beneath centuries of dust. Beneath kingdoms that rose and fell without ever saying his name. He waited. Not for fame. Not for vengeance. Just for peace. But peace didn't come. Instead, it was flashbulbs. Shipping crates. Climate-controlled glass boxes. A king without a crown. Just a passport. Traveling through time zones and headlines. Tutankhamun didn't build monuments. He didn't conquer nations. He didn't leave behind speeches, philosophies, or legacies etched in stone. What he left behind was quieter. A broken leg, a misaligned spine, a collection of sandals, a lock of hair, a child's toys, a kiss on linen. It's strange, isn't it, that the most famous pharaoh in history was, in truth, a boy who barely lived. He wasn't Tut the Conqueror, or Tut the Great. He was Tutankhamun, the one who restored the old gods. But not because he believed, because he was told to. His reign was short. His decisions, few. Most of his legacy, other people's choices. And yet, here we are, talking about him, dreaming through him, filling his silences with our noise, making him mean things he never said, wanting him to symbolize something, anything. So we don't have to admit we're just afraid of being forgotten. Because maybe that's the secret. It was never about a curse, or treasure, or mystery. Maybe it was about us. Our hunger for meaning. Our obsession with legacy. Our fear that death is quiet. And so are we. Tutankhamun became a symbol, not of power, but of fragility. Not of wealth, but of absence. And in that absence, we saw ourselves. Lonely, curious, exhausted, desperate for someone to have left a light on. But he didn't. He left a tomb. A small, rushed, awkward tomb. Filled with things not meant to last. And somehow, they lasted anyway. So maybe this is your cue. To stop chasing legends. To stop measuring worth in gold. To take the myth off the pedestal and see the boy beneath it. Not a king, not a ghost, just someone who lived, briefly, and waited, patiently, to be seen. Now you've seen him, and maybe, just for tonight, that's enough. So close your eyes. Let the gold rest. Let the silence speak. Let the boy sleep. And maybe, just maybe, you sleep with him.